Hello everyone, welcome back to Chess on Fire. It has been pretty long since we talked about endgames, so today we are going to continue our series of 99 endgames, and this is the second episode of that. In today's video, I aim to teach you a total of 17 endgame positions, which are all about rook endings. Of course, in rook endings, pawn endgame theory also applies, so if you haven't checked out the last video about pawn endgames, please go check it out, but today we will be focusing on rook endgames. And I must say, in this series, my hope is to show you what you need to study in endgames, and show you the core fundamentals of each type of endgame. So even if you didn't study rook endgames on your own, I believe you should have a decent ability to play these positions well. And if you, of course, study the endgames following the outline I gave you, of course, you would receive great results in your chess endgames. Personally, I'm not really that good at endgames, so I'm also learning alongside with you. Let's begin with position number 1. Actually, position number 34 in our series. Now, this is a position where this is an example of when a pawn is stronger than the rook. So this pawn here is actually going to beat this rook, and take a moment to see if you can find how. I hope you pause the video, and I believe the natural move here would be pawn to c7, but actually there's this critical defensive resource of rook e6. Now let's say the white king plays king c5. That is a mistake. Why? Because there is this critical defensive resource rook d1, of course rook d2 also works, no matter what he plays next. So if he tries to move the king somewhere like this, we just give another check. And when he comes over here, we give a check, and we take the pawn. This is a draw. Now, let's see what is the correct way to play this position, because we're trying to win with white. Now, the correct move here is actually king to b5, because after the same idea, we're going to keep on moving down the board. When we arrive here, you will suddenly realize that there is no resource to bring the rook down here and give a check. But indeed, there is still a great move here, which is rook d4, a last resource. Now, if we naturally just play this and queen, it is a mistake, because rook c4, queen takes, this is stalemate. You see, all 3 squares are covered, and that is a stalemate. But the correct move here, evidently, would be c8 rook. Now, of course, this doesn't work because the a2 square is not covered now, and this is also threatening rook a8, so the only move would be rook a4, but here king b3 threatens again rook c1, attacking the rook on a4, and the position is lost for black. So indeed, this position is actually covered in one of my shorts. This is a really inspiring puzzle as well, but if you know the basic idea of how it is even remotely possible for a pawn to beat a rook, this should be easy for you. So let's move on to the second example. Go for white is to achieve a win, but now let's focus on what is the correct move to actually win. Now here the move would be rook g5. This is cutting the king off, a critical idea in rook endgames. If you look at this piece over here, this rook, its critical difference from a pawn, a bishop, and a knight is the fact that it can just cut a king off entirely on itself. So that is one of the critical components of rook endgames, and I will be talking about several others in this video as well. Now you see, if a4, we simply just ignore it, allow it to be pushed further. But now rook g3. You can't hop your king over to defend this pawn, so he's destined to play a2, and now rook a3 simply wins this pawn. Now in this case, this seems as if, but actually it is not a win for white, and let's see if we can find out why. Indeed, the move here would be b1 knight, and the logic behind which is that this position is actually a draw. This is the critical defensive move, and we simply come back, there's no way to make progress. This is a follow-up with cutting the king off, the first critical component I mentioned. This is the second, which is gaining a tempo with a check. For instance, in this position, black would play this, hoping to bring the pawn down the board. If we play rook f8 here, instead of rook g8, he would need to go here, and after rook g8, king f3, you would see that comparing these two positions, we just simply got an extra round, and with this, we can successfully bring our king closer to achieve the goal of capturing this pawn. Now, finally, we're done with rook versus one pawn, and let me just quickly mention the fact that 2 pawns on the 6th rank can beat a rook on their own. This is just something that you need to keep in mind. Many tactical puzzles of converting a position from a middle game-ish endgame to a pure endgame, or to a pure winning endgame, consists of this tactical motif, which is 2 pawns on the 6th rank beats a rook. Another case of rook versus 2 pawns. Evidently, this position, white is of course trying to fight for a draw, and the idea here is pretty interesting. We could call it a pendulum, because when the king is over here, you go this way, because it's farther here from this to this direction. Now, if the king tries to go here and attempts to promote, you just take there, and no matter where the king goes, we just capture the pawn, draw. If he decides, okay, I'm going to try to go over here and attempt king c2, the move, guess what, is simply sliding back, and if here, there's simply no way to get out of it. But now, let's bring us to the main part of today's video, which is rook versus rook. Of course, there will be pawn imbalances. That is what we're trying to study today. So let's bring us to the first and potentially the easiest example. So here we have a pawn on the 7th rank. And let's think about how we can actually win this game. Evidently, we're trying to get our king out somehow and just push the pawn. But the key question here is how to first avoid checks And second, how to drive this king away, because we're trying to get out this way, not this way, evidently. So the first move naturally would be to give a check, bring the king over, and actually here the move is rook g4. Rook g5 also works, demonstrates an idea of bridging the third critical component of today's video. This check will lose the game immediately because of king f7, so he might play something like rook d2, trying to cut your king off from the side of the board. Now, what you do here is king f7, after checks, king e6, oh, rook e2, king f6, rook f2, king e5, rook e2, rook e4. Surprisingly, you managed to block the rook's check with your rook. The rook has no way to jump over here or something like that, so evidently the next move would be promotion. Now, of course, let's bring us back to the original position. Let me tell you what you can also study. First, let's clean the board. And what you're supposed to study is, first, what if this pawn is on other squares? Like, all of these 6 squares, 8 squares are possible. You could just keep this king over here, and you just change the position of the pawn in these 5 squares. And let's see, and you can study how to win each game, or more specifically, is there any situations in which you cannot win? And now, evidently, after studying the pawn on the 7th rank, we should study the pawn on the 6th rank. So what we're going to cover in this position, position 41, is passive defense with rook. The rook, you see, is trying to stay on the last rank to stop checkmate. So here, the correct move would be to cut the king off. Again, you see this critical component appearing again. Let's just say he plays rook c8. Now we give a check, and if this, we go like this, and we win the rook. Now, if king f8, the same thing applies, rook h7. We're utilizing the fact that these 2 pieces are poorly placed, and this is actually checkmate threat. So evidently, the on move here would be king g8. Now push here, here, here. Oh, this results with the same thing. Now, of course, if we come back to this position, again, let's clear off the arrows. I think you should probably consider what if the pawn is not here. It could be here, 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 here. Again, same thing. And I probably should tell you if the pawn is actually positioned over here. If it is a knight pawn, this is actually a draw. Why? Because evidently we cannot play rook h7. Because if the pawn is over here, rook h7 will literally mean going here, which is impossible. Let's move on to the next position. Actually, this is not necessarily a problem related with the 5th rank. Remember, in the last position, we talked about how this is passive defense. Now, actually, in this example, even though we're dealing with a pawn on the 5th rank, there's no way to stop it from advancing to the 6th rank. And let's examine, what if the rook here stays over here? And this is called active defense. You see, after rook b6, we're cutting the king off. Again, you see cutting the king off. e6, only move to make progress in the position. Now we simply bring our rook back. With king f6, we just give a check. There's no way to get out of it. And if you try to check his king, there's no way forward. And in Rook Endgames, the way to evaluate whether a position results in a draw is actually examining whether there are any potential in the position. After rook b1, no matter what we try, it is always a draw, so it is a draw. This next example actually appeared in a game between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana. So in this endgame, I'm not only going to focus on a lone rook pawn, I'm also going to talk about how these 2 pawns can actually go together. Now, let me first show you the line. So here it gives a check, king comes up, the rook attacks both pawns, the king keeps on coming up, and surprisingly the move here is rook f5. Not rook h5. I will explain very soon. Now, evidently, the king is cut off again. You see, cutting the king off, always appearing. Now we're trying to push this pawn. So here, rook f6, king b5, rook f5 checks. So we're simply rerouting over here. If he tries to follow you, you just go back. There's no progress to be made. The king is always cut off over here. And whenever he decides, okay, I've had enough, I'm going to push, this is a theoretical draw, because we're going to keep on checking. There's no way to escape that. If he tries to run the king away, I'm simply going to put my rook over here and defend. There's no way to escape this defensive resource. So first of all, we're trying to cut the king off, and when it is not possible, or more importantly, when he is trying to run away with the pawn, when this pawn arrives on the 6th rank, we're going to play rook to the 6th rank as well. And now, evidently, he's going to bring the king up further, and now we stand our defense. We simply give checks. Now, of course, if he comes here, that does not change anything. We just check and keeps him back. But, and as long as his king is staying around here, to protect the square a6, we're just going to keep on giving checks, and he cannot escape. Once he tries to run closer, we're going to slide the rook over, and if he tries to run back, we are going to move away, and if he tries to push the pawn, we're going to instantly plop our rook on the a file, and there's no way to make progress. Now, you notice that here, this move, rook f5, is the correct move, not rook h5, and you would probably wonder why. And the simple reason is that this king is blocking this rook. The line goes as a6, and if we're trying to bring the rook over, the winning idea is pretty simple. is basically that we're going to run the king all the way over and play some shuffling game. And yeah, this is simply winning. We managed to run the pawn up. So if we do not play rook a5, rather rook f5, just like we played over here, the difference you see is that we have this move, another critical winning move. If rook a5, we're going to play rook b6. And if this, we're going to go here and run the king up. Again, we are going to play this little puzzle piece over here. And this position, rather this situation, is called the Vancouver position. And actually, this is a win for white. But surprisingly, with this extra pawn over here, of this pawn, this is actually a draw. Because if we try the exact same thing, you see over here, we had rook h5 and a6. The logic of which is, if this move happens, we will play this. And if checks, we run here, and surprisingly, he runs out of checks. And in this case, our rook never arrived onto this file. We were never forced to bring our rook over, and it is a draw. And now let's move on to the next example, position 44. So the next example, in fact, is also a position where it's rook versus rook with two pawns. But it's slightly different because it's not A and H pawns now, it's F and H pawns, which of course would be a significant difference. And let's take a second to guess whether this position is a win or a draw. Remember, when there is no progress that can possibly be made, it is a draw. So try to evaluate the position. Well, you guys probably saw the first move, rook g6, and indeed here the move will be king f7 to defend, and of course rook g5 we can trade, rook b1, and now we have taken the defensive measure of coming around the pawns. This is the fourth most important component in Rook Endgames, which is chasing the pawns from behind. And generally, this also works for the king. We're also trying to chase the king from behind. And I guess it's about time for me to reveal the answer. This position is a draw. Let me show you why. So the first possible attempt here would be rook c5. The second, in my opinion, would be h6. Let's take a look at each one of them. Rook c5. Here we play rook g1, simply give a check. If he tries to play king f5, now we play king g7, stopping this. After rook c7, king h6, we have rounded over to defend to attack this pawn. The only way for white to defend would be to play rook c8. And now what we do isn't taking this pawn, because this runs into checkmate. So what we do here would be to play rook a1. And we're coming around to check around this side, the long side. There's sufficient space for the rook to run around over here. Now, of course, if rook h8, we just come back, chase him out, and come back here, that would not make any progress, so rook g8. Then we simply wait. Whenever he tries to run away, we give a check. He comes back, we come back. And thereby, in no way can white achieve anything apart from this position, so we just need to wait here, and there's no progress to be made. So black successfully holds the draw. In this position, there is also h6 to create some threats. And now, again, we're going to slide this way. And let me show you why. Rook h5, this, again, you see, is chasing the pawns from behind. And even though this is my rook, this rule also applies because of the fact that this is the best position to support the pawn. Now, here, the correct move from black is the passive-looking king g8. But in fact, this is the only way to hold the position. And if white tries to make progress further, push the pawns, we come around over here. You recognize the setup. Now the king is again attacking this pawn, while this king has no way to defend this pawn. So the rook is either stuck defending the pawn or standing in a position in which it is threatening a checkmate from capturing this pawn. So actually, there's no way for white to support this pawn to be pushed forward because the rook cannot give a check from g7. Thereby, that means we can now simply run around with our rook, giving checks of king g5, we come around here. If he tries to go up, we check this way. If he tries to move the rook out of the way, we simply give another check. Like this, for example, rook h2, rook g1, king f6, we run back. If he tries to go here, we continue giving checks over here. And if he tries to come back to g5, then we just give another check. So again, there's no progress to be made from white. Thereby, it is again a draw. I hope you understand this position. So now let's move on to position number 45. Which is a fascinating position of pawn versus pawn with both rooks on the board. Here, in fact, the correct move, perhaps the only move, would be to play king b8. What is the idea here? It is hiding behind this king to avoid any checks from this rook. So here, let's say black plays rook b2. We go here. If rook c2, then a pretty insane maneuver you will be seeing pretty soon. Let me just show you. Checks, run the king up, another check, run the king up, another check. And here, a puzzle for all of you. What does white play to go for a win? In fact, the correct move here would be to play rook h2. And after rook h2, we queen. Actually, this position is not that easy to win, queen versus rook. So in future episodes, I believe I am planning it for episode 5 of our 99 Endgame series, I will be explaining how you can win this position and how you can put up the maximum effort against the queen. So let's save this for later, but queen versus rook, of course, is advantageous for white, and white can push for a win. Now, after you observed this position, commonly known as Lasker's idea, let us move on to position number 46, a classic example of two pawns versus one. And this shows you how you're supposed to defend again. And in fact, the move here would be rook b8. Another time that this critical component shows up, we are trying to give checks on, because in fact, if we don't play rook b8 yet, we can let's just skip around. If we don't play rook b8, black plays f4. In which after king h2, king h4, you would see that this is the threat, and if you move the rook, we come over here to win this pawn. So this is a winning position for black. But luckily, we do have rook b8, and if the same thing is attempted, of course, here, we don't go here, in view of trying to running back with the king, you see, if black here plays this, checks. Oh, actually, white straight up checkmated black. So evidently, that would be a huge mistake. But if he doesn't try to push up with the king, suppose rook c2, now king f3, if we check again, we simply come back. Now if he tries to play rook g3, we slide into the corner, and once he tries to get out again, we simply follow up again with our king. You see, the idea here would be, again, to run into the cycle, and there's no way to break through it. So let's say here black changes strategy. He tries to play king g6. Now we play rook f8, cutting the king off, targeting this pawn, so that he can't push this move. Now here if a check, we again go here, and if he tries to change strategy yet again, he might go here, then we defend from the backside, and if he tries to chase, we come up here. If he chases again, of course, we just keep on rounding about, and if he tries to go for something else, let's say king f6, of course we can go back. If rook h1, we target his rook. Let's say he slides out of the way, and now you could just tease him a bit with this, and again playing rook f5, targeting this pawn. If rook d2, king f3, rook d3, let's just not go here, too risky. We just go with whatever we know is a draw. We fall back, king g6, we go back, and there's no way to push any further. So again, this is a draw. So from now on, we will be examining positions where white has the extra pawn on the a file. Generally, we don't consider the extra pawn on h file as anything special, because naturally the two kings are positioned over here. But in fact, if in positions where both sides castled alongside, then you could just understand it as a reflected version of the a pawn. Now, I'm going to explain three plans to win with the a7 pawn. Now, evidently, the first would be to promote and win the rook, if possible. But this, even though it's the most basic idea behind these positions, it is not generally actually doable. So I'm going to explain two more plans that can help you win a position like this. The first plan would be to sacrifice this pass pawn at some point in order to exchange the rooks, because my pawn structure over here is better than his pawn structure, and with an actively placed king, we can win. Let me show you how. So these moves are played. Now rook c1, king d6. Of course, if any more checks, we could run over like this. So now let's say he goes back with rook a1. Now we surprise him with rook c8, and after rook a7, we play rook c7, takes, and here you see we secure opposition. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go check out episode 1 of 99 Endgames. It's going to teach you how to win these pawn endgames. Let me just briefly show you how. I won't go into details, but evidently this pawn is going to be lost soon, and this will be the killing pawn of the game. Now, let me show you plan 2. The second plan is that sometimes the pass pawn can be exchanged for multiple pawns on this side of the board in order to win, even though the pawns are all on the same side. Generally, this means 2 extra pawns, because usually 1 extra pawn can't win. But that's simply usually. There are special cases, of course. Now, here, the line follows as, first we push his king back, and now we secure our pawn on the 7th rank, the purpose of which would be to pose a larger threat, evidently. Now, after rook a2, king d3, our goal, of course, would be to run over, and when he can't give a check, to, bring the rook out and protect with our king. But evidently, this plan is not that easy to execute, so he do have some time to spare before we actually pose a threat. Now, king d4, rook a5, king c4, rook a3, king c5, rook a1, king d6, rook a3, king e7, rook a6, king f7, and that's when you start realizing the purpose is not to run over this side, but we're trying to go over this side, and indeed the targets would be these pawns. But I do believe if imagine a scenario where this pawn disappears and these 2 pawns also disappears, it is actually a draw, because these 2 pawns aren't these 2 pawn advantages are not powerful enough. So yeah, white still got work to be done, and we cannot rush with bringing the rook over. In fact, the next move would be king g7 and then king h6 after we are now attacking both pawns with our king, and after rook a6, rook b8 is the critical move here. After rook a7, we give a check, king e6, king g6, and this pawn is also lost in a few moves. This is indeed a winning rook endgame. Next, the final two examples of today's video would be rook versus knight and rook versus bishop. Generally, both situations are normally a draw, but there are special cases. Now, surprisingly, a knight holds better than a bishop, and let me explain how. Basically, except a few examples where the knight becomes separated from the king because it can be trapped, or when the knight is in the corner and can be lost through zugzwang. Apart from these two situations, a knight draws easily against a rook, and I won't go into the depth of explaining how to defend because it is generally something you can simply think up during your games. Now, this situation is actually a winning position for white, because after rook d1, you see, this knight is really feeling a bit clumped here, and there are no way to escape. Now, evidently, the only move that can be made by black would be a king move. And now, the critical move here is not this, because this does not threaten checkmate, rather king a6. And now, knight c5, king b6, knight a4, king c6. You see, the knight is being pushed out, and now he either needs to go here or there. Now, let's say knight c3, for example. Now, the critical move is not rook c1. Try to find the move yourself. It's rook e1, because now you see 6 out of the 8 squares that the knight can go to is being protected. After knight a2, we play rook b1, and after king c8, we play king d6. And let me show you why this position is absolutely lost for black. There are indeed 4 legal moves from black, of which are those. And now, if this move is played, if king d8 is played, checkmate. So evidently not king d8. And of course, the knight cannot go here or there. If knight c3, we go here, win the knight. Again, we are definitely going to win. So all 4 options loses for black, thereby we're going to win. Next, we will be talking about rook versus bishop. The rule is, if the king is on the same side as the bishop, it is lost for the bishop side. Because evidently, the bishop can only block the checks over here and there, and these two positions are lost for the bishop side. But imagine a case where the king jumps all the way over here. Now, the bishop can go here and cover here or there. So if a white tries to pin the bishop, it's going to lead to stalemate, and if he doesn't, there are literally no way to checkmate. So that situation would be a draw. Thereby following this rule, this position evidently is a win for white. Now here, the correct move is actually g7. Of course, if this, we go here, here. Let me just show you the line. If this, and this is checkmate. Now, of course, he cannot capture the pawn, king h7, and now the critical move here would be rook f7. Don't mind the colors. It is a really low depth engine, so it doesn't really understand what we're talking about. And after this pawn is actually taking away the critical square to win this position. So we are going to sacrifice it. g8 queen, king g8, and now king g6. Now the bishop literally has nowhere to go to. Of course, it can't go somewhere like this because we're going to checkmate him. And if he goes to a square like this, there's simply not enough room over here. Let me show you why. Rook f1, bishop h2, now rook f2, bishop g3, rook g2, bishop d6, and now rook d2. That should make sense. And if he tries to go anywhere else, I mean, it doesn't work. Because, of course, these squares is going to lead to the loss of the bishop directly, and this square would be met with this. Similarly, all of these squares over there. Now, of course, the most difficult situations would be these two, and if bishop f4, simply rook c2 wins. Bishop coming there to defend would be futile, we already know that. That means on the move king f8, and now rook f2 wins this bishop. Similarly, if this is played, then I believe we simply go there. If bishop f2, then we threaten checkmate. If king f8, then rook f4, that's a win. If something like bishop e7, then we can just go there, because king f8, checkmate. Of course, there's this, and this is winning. As for bishop d8, this is probably winning, because again, this is zugzwang. The bishop can't go here, here, here. The king can't move over here. So the bishop needs to choose between these squares. Now we already know if this, we go rook c4 or something like that. If all of these squares, we simply target the bishop, and that simultaneously threatens checkmate. So white is absolutely winning. So even though this position looks kind of simple, it is actually not that easy to win. Perhaps it takes some exercise for you to quickly understand what situations you can lead to checkmate. But let me just give a quick summary of when the bishop tends to be lost. So first, of course, the bishop can't step onto squares that the rook and the king protects. And the second way is moving to a square where the rook can attack the bishop while threatening checkmate, or similarly, pin the bishop to a checkmating square. The second situation would be a pin, and the third situation, of which the most complex, would be something like this, because this is blocking the escaping square. And of course, the fourth situation is perhaps the most difficult to deal with, but actually a simple waiting move can win the game immediately. So I hope you understand this final example, and we are currently staring at position 50 of our series. And today's video is basically finished in a way. We have already talked about rook versus pawn, rook versus rook, rook pawn endgames, and then I've also shared something about rook versus knight and rook versus bishop. I hope these help you, but as I mentioned, rook endgames, rook pawn endgames to be more exact, is literally the hardest endgame of all endgames. It is even more difficult than queen endgames, so it takes case-by-case study to understand which positions are wins and which positions are draws. So it's definitely going to take time. If you guys really wanted, I could start explaining every single rook endgame situation in the future after we finish 99 endgames. If you guys need it, please tell me below in the comment section so I know what to do next. And apart from that, you could also try to study it on your own. Next time in this 99 endgame series, I'll be talking about queen endgames and combined endgames of all kinds of pieces in the next video. And the video after that, I will be talking about endgame strategy. I think I'm going to show you 16 or something like that, 16 examples demonstrating complex endgame positions, and I'm going to talk about how the strategy, moreover calculation, is going to win you the game. So tune in. I've got a lot of fun stuff coming up in our endgame series, and of course middle game, chess 960, tactics, all of them. I'm going to resume them because we have already finished the Road to 2500 series. So stay active on my channel, and I hope to see you next time for more interesting chess content.